Jake LaMotta was unforgettable in the ring. But outside the ropes, his life spiraled into jealousy, scandal, and dangerous ties that clung to him like a shadow. Hollywood tried to warn us, turning his demons into one of the most haunting films ever made. But even that portrayal only scratched the surface. The true danger of Jake LaMotta was far darker than the legend on screen. Jake LaMotta built a career that still gets talked about whenever the greats of boxing are mentioned. And it wasn't just about the victories, but about the way he earned them. Across 106 professional fights, he recorded 83 wins, 19 losses, and 4 draws. And out of those wins, 30 came by knockout. Opponents quickly learned that fighting LaMotta meant facing a man who never backed down, who kept charging through punches that would have stopped almost anyone else. And that is why the names the Bronx Bull and Raging Bull followed him throughout his career. Those weren't just catchy nicknames, they were accurate reflections of his style, because once the bell rang, he turned into a fighter who never gave you room to breathe and who could take punishment just as well as he could hand it out. The defining moment in his career came in 1949 when LaMotta took on Marcel Cerdan, a respected champion, and came out as the new world middleweight champion. That win didn't just give him a belt, it gave him a permanent place in the history of the sport, and even decades later, his impact kept being recognized. In 1990, he was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame, and Ring Magazine continued to rank him among the best middleweights of all time. Yet behind all the victories and the recognition, there was a much darker side to Jake LaMotta, and the truth is that those problems didn't suddenly appear when he became famous. They started when he was just a boy. Jake LaMotta grew up surrounded by poverty and hardship under the bright lights of Madison Square Garden. Money was tight in his family, so tight that his father sometimes had him fight other neighborhood boys just to collect coins from the spectators, and that money often went straight toward helping the family pay rent. Those early backyard brawls weren't just games, they were survival, and they planted the first seeds of what would later become one of the most punishing fighting styles the sport of boxing had ever seen. As a kid, LaMotta already had a bad temper, and it didn't take much to set him off. The streets became his first real training ground, where he fought anyone who crossed him. Unsurprisingly, this energy, combined with the struggles at home, eventually pushed him into deep trouble when he attempted a robbery, an act that landed him in a reformatory upstate. What could have been the end of his story before it even started actually became the turning point. Because inside those walls, he discovered boxing in a more structured way. It was during his time there that he began to take the raw instincts he already had from street fights and channel them into a skill that could change his life. When he was released, LaMotta tried to find a different path. Like many young men of his generation, he attempted to enlist in the military during World War II, but his application was rejected because a childhood mastoid operation had impaired his hearing, ruining his chances of meeting the physical requirement of serving. That rejection may have closed one door, but it left another wide open, because without the war to distract him, he leaned fully into boxing. LaMotta's amateur career was short but extraordinary. He never lost a single amateur bout, and that gave him the confidence to turn professional at just 19 years old in 1941. Stepping into the professional ranks was no small leap, especially for someone with such a rough background and no polished training early on. But LaMotta immediately began to show what made him different. He could take a hit like almost no one else, and his chin became the stuff of legends even in those early fights. Spectators noticed that no matter how cleanly an opponent landed, LaMotta refused to go down, and that resilience combined with his constant pressure created a reputation that spread quickly. He didn't waste years finding his footing in the pro ranks, because from the very beginning, his aggressive style and relentless forward motion made him a dangerous opponent. Managers, promoters, and boxing fans could see there was something raw but special in this young fighter from the Bronx, someone who might not look like the traditional boxer with polished moves and perfect form, but who carried a toughness that couldn't be taught. In every round he fought, and in every punch he threw, people could see the marks of his childhood struggles. His early life had given him a relentless drive, but it also left scars that never really healed, and those personal battles would follow him long after he became a champion. Jake LaMotta may have been celebrated as one of the toughest men ever to step inside a boxing ring, but away from the crowd and the cheers, his battles were often with himself. Fame and success gave him recognition, yet they didn't quiet the storm inside his head. He was known for his jealousy, which often tipped over into full-blown paranoia, and those feelings usually came out as violent outbursts. The people closest to him, the ones who should have felt protected, were often the ones who faced the sharpest edge of his temper. Friends, family, and partners all saw a side of LaMotta that the public never witnessed in the ring. A man who could explode with anger in ways that were as destructive as any punch he ever threw in competition. Deep down, LaMotta struggled with feelings that he never really managed to control. Despite being admired as a world champion and respected as one of the most durable fighters in boxing, he wrestled with insecurity and self-worth. Winning titles and earning money did not erase the doubts he carried from his early years, and those doubts came back in toxic ways. He could dominate in front of thousands of fans, yet when he was alone with his thoughts, he often questioned himself, sometimes tearing down his own achievements before anyone else could. It created a cycle of hubris mixed with self-sabotage, a pattern that followed him through many stages of his career. This behavior became even clearer once his boxing days were behind him. When he retired in 1954, LaMotta was only in his early 30s, and while most people would see that as a chance to enjoy what they had built, for him it was the beginning of a difficult search for identity. The routine of training, fighting, and proving himself had defined his life for so long that when it suddenly stopped, he didn't know who he was without it. Like many athletes, the absence of competition left him feeling empty, and he looked for other ways to fill the space. He tried his hand at acting, appearing in a few films and television shows, and even gave stand-up comedy a shot, surprising audiences with a completely different side of his personality. There were attempts at running businesses as well, but most of these efforts brought mixed results. Some worked for a while, others failed, and nothing ever gave him the same sense of purpose that boxing once had. The cheers of the crowd were hard to replace, and the applause from comedy clubs or the short appearances on screen never reached the same heights. Along with those struggles came legal troubles and a level of public scrutiny that only added to the sense of instability in his life. Stories about his violent behavior, his temper, and the way he treated people began to surface more openly, and his reputation outside of boxing often looked very different from the way fans remembered him inside the ring. He became a man both admired and criticized, and that mix left him fighting shadows long after he had left the ropes behind. The truth was that LaMotta never found it easy to balance his successes with the darker parts of his personality, and those personal battles often spilled into every relationship he had. His temper, his paranoia, and his self-destructive streak deeply impacted his career and private life. But nowhere was that impact more visible than in his marriages and romances. Jake LaMotta's personal life often made as many headlines as his boxing career, and one of the most striking parts of his story was the trail of marriages and relationships that left just as much drama as his fights in the ring. Over the course of his life, he was married 7 times, which alone tells you how turbulent his love life really was. And the marriage that drew the most attention was the one to Jake LaMotta, who was with him from 1947 until 1957. Their relationship produced 3 children, but it also became a centerpiece in the story of who Jake was outside the ring, because Vicky later spoke openly about the jealousy, control, and maltreatment that came with being married to him. She described a household where LaMotta's suspicions and temper often created a tense and sometimes dangerous environment. His jealousy wasn't subtle, it was extreme, and it frequently led to accusations and confrontations that chipped away at their marriage. Vicky revealed that she endured maltreatment during their time together, and LaMotta himself admitted later in life that he had been unfaithful and controlling, confirming that many of the stories about his behavior were true. In many ways, the intensity he carried into his fights spilled over into his personal life, but instead of entertaining crowds, it caused chaos behind closed doors. The pattern didn't end with Vicky. LaMotta's later marriages and relationships often followed the same rhythm of passion, conflict, and eventual collapse. He had 6 children altogether, but the instability in his relationships meant that family life was never simple. His fame only magnified these problems because the spotlight made his private struggles public, and the pressures of being constantly recognized didn't make it any easier for him to maintain stability. Partners often found themselves caught between the attention that came with his name and the volatility that came with his personality. LaMotta himself never shied away from admitting the flaws in his behavior. He seemed to recognize the damage he caused without fully stepping away from the destructive patterns that had followed him since his youth. Each marriage began with the promise of something new, but more often than not, it ended with the same issues of mistrust, anger, and explosive arguments that pushed people away. Some lasted only a few years, others even less, and each ended with another broken connection that added to the complicated picture of LaMotta's life outside the sport. He lived fast, he loved hard, but he rarely built the kind of long-term stability that could have balanced out his darker side. By the time he was older, LaMotta's legacy as a fighter was secure, but the stories of his marriages and his behavior toward women followed him everywhere, shaping the way many people viewed him outside of boxing. Fame didn't shield him from criticism, and in some ways, it made his mistakes even more visible. To make matters worse, LaMotta also found himself tied to a long list of scandals and questionable choices that kept him in the headlines even after his boxing career ended. LaMotta wasn't just known for his toughness in the ring. He was also known for the kind of decisions that blurred the line between ambition and trouble. His name carried weight in boxing, but it also carried stories of mob influence, personal scandals, and behavior that often turned fans into critics. One of the most infamous moments in his career came in 1960 when LaMotta admitted that he deliberately threw a fight against Billy Fox. This wasn't just about losing a match, it was about working with organized crime figures who controlled much of boxing at the time. LaMotta wanted a title shot, and the price of moving closer to that dream was handing over a fight that everyone expected him to win. Fans were confused when he looked strangely passive in the ring that night, but years later he confirmed the suspicions. By his own account, he took money from the mob and went down in order to secure the connections he needed to eventually get a chance at the middleweight championship. It was a decision that haunted his reputation, because while he eventually did win the title, people always remembered the fight he gave away. But this wasn't the end of his dealings with organized crime. When he faced Marcel Cerdan for the middleweight crown in 1949, LaMotta later revealed that he had paid a $20,000 matchmaker's fee to mob figures to make sure the fight happened. To many, this was another reminder of how deeply the underworld had its grip on boxing during that era, and LaMotta's role in it placed him right at the center of the sport's darker side. The truth came out more fully in 1960 when he was called before the Senate Subcommittee on Antitrust and Monopoly, where he testified about the corruption in boxing. Sitting before lawmakers, LaMotta admitted openly to throwing the Billy Fox fight and to the money that exchanged hands with the mob. This very moment exposed what many had long suspected about boxing in the 1940s and 1950s, but hearing it straight from one of the sport's biggest names made it all the more shocking. His problems didn't end with boxing politics. After retirement, LaMotta faced a series of arrests for various offenses, which only added to his reputation as a man who couldn't stay away from trouble. These weren't the kind of headlines a retired champion wanted, but LaMotta's name was regularly connected to legal issues that reminded people his temper and reckless choices extended beyond the ropes. In interviews and even in his memoir, LaMotta admitted to inappropriate behavior toward women and even acknowledged acts that crossed serious moral and legal lines. Even when discussed in a mild way for public audiences, these confessions left a stain on his legacy, because they weren't accusations from others, but admissions from LaMotta himself. This dual image followed him everywhere. On one hand, he was celebrated as the Raging Bull, the champion who fought with heart and grit, a man who stood toe-to-toe with the best fighters of his generation. On the other hand, he was criticized for the choices he made outside the ring, from his ties to organized crime to the pain he caused in his personal life. By the time films, books, and retrospectives began to look back at his life, the question was no longer just about his greatness as a fighter, but about whether his darker side should be remembered with equal weight. And that very question became the focus of a documentary that set out to show the truth about Jake LaMotta, not just the legend, but the man behind it. Few athletes have had their lives turned into a cultural milestone the way LaMotta did, and the legacy of that portrayal is almost as famous as the man himself. It all started with his memoir, Raging Bull. My Story, a book he co-wrote that laid out the details of his career and his personal life with a level of honesty that shocked many readers. LaMotta didn't shy away from admitting the darkest parts of himself. He spoke about the maltreatment, the jealousy, the criminal behavior, and the choices that defined him not only as a fighter, but also as a flawed human being. In a time when many athletes preferred to polish their image for the public, LaMotta's book stood out for its rawness and determination to tell the truth, no matter how damaging it was. This memoir eventually inspired one of the most critically acclaimed films in cinema history, Raging Bull, released in 1980. Directed by Martin Scorsese with a screenplay by Paul Schrader and Mardik Martin, the movie took LaMotta's life story and turned it into a powerful exploration of self-destruction, obsession, and the emotional cost of greatness. Scorsese made the unusual choice to shoot the film in black and white, which gave it the feel of authentic 1940s boxing footage, while also adding a timeless quality that set it apart from other sports films of its era. Robert De Niro's portrayal of LaMotta became legendary for the extreme lengths he went to embody the role. De Niro trained like a real boxer, fought in matches to understand the mechanics of the ring, and even gained a significant amount of weight to play the older version of LaMotta. The dedication paid off because the film won 2 Academy Awards, including Best Actor for De Niro, and it was nominated for 8 in total. Critics hailed it as one of the greatest films ever made, and a raw character study of a man who could destroy opponents in the ring but often destroyed himself in everyday life. LaMotta's reaction to the movie was complicated. At first, he disliked the way he was portrayed. In interviews, he admitted that watching the film was uncomfortable because it forced him to see his own flaws magnified on screen. He even joked at one point saying, "When I saw the film, I was upset. I kind of look bad in it. Then I realized it was true. That's the way it was. It's not the way I am now, but the way I was then." This line summed up the strange relationship he had with his cinematic legacy. He didn't enjoy seeing his temper, paranoia, and inappropriate behavior laid out for the world, yet he couldn't deny that the film captured the reality of his life better than anyone else ever could. Beyond Scorsese's classic, LaMotta's story has been revisited again and again in documentaries and interviews. Several other documentaries explored different sides of his life, while countless talk shows and boxing retrospectives kept his story alive. These appearances gave audiences direct access to LaMotta's own voice, sometimes charming, sometimes unsettling, but always authentic. He didn't filter his words much, and that rawness made him an endlessly fascinating subject for filmmakers and journalists alike. At some point, even people who had never watched a single middleweight bout knew Jake LaMotta's name because of Raging Bull. The film ensured that LaMotta would never fade into history as just another champion. Instead, he became a cultural figure, studied in film schools, debated in discussions about toxic masculinity, and remembered as the man whose life was too complex to be reduced to wins and losses. Even after the boxing gloves were long gone, Jake LaMotta never truly stepped out of the public eye. Well into his 90s, he continued to make appearances, give interviews, and share stories about a career that had become legend. The fans were fascinated by his past in the ring and by the way he spoke about it unapologetically. Yet behind those appearances, his later years carried a heavy share of personal loss. He lost 2 sons, Jake Jr. to cancer and Joseph in a plane crash, tragedies that weighed on him deeply for the rest of his life. Despite his fame and the cultural spotlight that came with Raging Bull, he reportedly lived modestly in his later years, far removed from the flash and luxury that some imagined. On September 19, 2017, Jake LaMotta passed away at the age of 95, closing the final chapter of a life that was as complicated as it was unforgettable. He is remembered as a symbol of resilience and toughness, a man who could absorb punishment like no other, but also as a figure of flawed greatness, someone who could beat anyone in the ring but never truly escaped himself. What do you think about LaMotta's behavior outside the ring? Drop your answers in the comment section below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more updates.